So this lecture sort of moves us into the next phase of the evolution of ancient Greek society, and really important because it's laying the foundation of some elements of what will emerge into the classical Greek period as really distinctive of this place and this period. So about 750 to 500 is the Archaic period. Arche in Greek means beginning. So really sort of beginning to see the sort of aspects of Greek society with which most of us are really familiar. This is a kouros. This is a statue that was really typical of this period. They would have been commissioned by sort of elite families and then positioned in sanctuaries as sort of gifts to gods. Very stylistic. They all look very similar, probably borrowing some elements from Eastern culture, especially Egypt. And we're going to track some of these developments in art and sculpture, not just because it sort of speaks to the cultural sophistication of Greece, but it also reflects advances in sort of technology and mathematical knowledge as well. So this quote, I think, for me, really captures what's so unique about ancient Greek culture, and in some respects continues to defy explanation. So this is from Donald Kagan, who is a historian, a very well-known historian of ancient Greece, and focusing in particular on Athens. And I think what, for me, is really sort of conveyed in this quote, we tend to think that democracy is sort of the natural evolution of all political systems, because it's so familiar and common in sort of the modern West. But as Kagan points out, if you go outside of the Greek world, almost every other civilization or culture has some sort of a monarch. And even when sort of Greece introduces democracy to varying degrees, it's relatively very short lived. So you can see the outlines of democratic government in Athens, which reaches sort of the most advanced form of democracy around 500. By 300, it's gone. And then you do not see democracy again until like 1776. That's a really long time. And I'm talking about the entire globe, not just Western European society. So, what is it that sort of explains why this particular form of government develops when it does and where it does? And so we'll touch on a few possible sort of elements that help kind of piece the puzzle together. But as I said, overall, the actual explanation is still very elusive. So one of the fundamental features that's so unique to the Greek world is the polis. And so you can see it here. It sort of evolves. The meaning of the term evolves over time. Initially, it seems to be, and remember, we're kind of piecing this together from some pretty sparse literary sources. So the initial meaning seems to be a place. It's this physical place within these archaic communities. Remember, the defensive fortifications of the Mycenaean period are gone. You no longer have these walled citadels. So you have more these open village settlements, which would have been vulnerable to attack. So the polis was sort of the high ground where if your village is attacked, that's where you send the women and the children and the elderly, because they would be sort of naturally protected. And in some instances, this becomes the place where you put sort of the spiritual center of the community. So the Acropolis is just an example of a polis in Athens. It's just a very well-known one. And typically, each of these sort of places had a patron deity that they were associated with. So Athens, the patron deity of Athens is Athena, Athena. And then the Acropolis in Athens, that sort of central temple in that sort of configuration of religious structures is dedicated to Athena. And there was this huge, like 8-foot statue of her inside. So initially, it's just like this place in the community. Over the course of time, though, it sort of changes its meaning. And it starts to mean something more than a place. It starts to take on this idea of a process. So from what we know, this was also the natural sort of point where people within the community would gather when they had to make important decisions. So when you have to make decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, who maybe to form an alliance with. Maybe you're making decisions about religious sort of celebrations. So people within the community would kind of come together. Not everybody. It would probably initially be just sort of the elite members of the aristocracy. But over the course of time, who gets to speak and who gets a say in those decisions starts to sort of expand until eventually what we see is that it includes all adult fighting men who eventually become defined as citizens. So it's still restricted, but it's much more sort of democratic than any of the governing systems that we've seen before. And then eventually the final phase, we see them referenced in lots of sort of written sources. The polis. The polis is like the community, it's like the state. So it would be like the polis of Athens or the polis of Corinth. And they don't just mean the physical place, they mean all of the people that sort of combined make decisions for that place, that help that place function. So we know that there are about 1,000 of these of varying degrees in size and population spread out across this sort of Mediterranean region. Typically, many of them had sort of an urban center. So if we think about Athens, we're not just talking about the walled city of Athens, we're also talking about the rural areas outside of Athens. And you can kind of see in that map Attica. So Attica references all the territory around, but that would have been part of the polis of Athens. Similarly, with Sparta, you have the actual city, the urban center, and then all of the people in Laconia and Messenia around would have been part of that polis. Citizenship then gradually, so whether or not you have a political voice, becomes sort of a defining feature of membership in these places. And as citizenship takes on a series of privileges and obligations, people start to become more and more concerned with regulating who is a citizen and who is not. In different places, they have different ways of making that determination. A lot of it comes through birth. Were you born to someone who was from Athens, or were you born to someone who was from Sparta? But it's something that they start to think a little bit more carefully about. So essentially what we're talking about then is a self-governing city-state where varying degrees of the population have a say in government. So why does this happen when it happens? Why do you go from very much sort of an almost, I wouldn't say an autocratic, but clearly a monarchy in the Mycenaean period, where you have kings in these different places who seem to have relatively unchecked authority? There is this tradition of assembling. We see this in the Iliad. Sort of Agamemnon makes the final call, but he brings together a lot of sort of the leading voices to at least have a discussion. So we do know there's this long history of sort of assembling and sort of discussing matters important to the community. But moving from that to dispensing with a monarchy, or the monarchy as the sole sort of governing system, is what's really a radical departure from everywhere else in the region at the time. So what starts to happen is we can sort of trace some of the threads here. So the emergence of sort of a noble elite, and these are probably the same people that were that sort of elite warrior class in the previous period. But what they start to do is they start to assume more and more of the responsibilities that had been invested in the person of the king. So you're kind of just spreading authority and roles out amongst more people. So initially, the result of this sort of diffusion of power is an oligarchy, right? So rule by sort of a small number of aristocrats, sort of rule. So it's group rule. It's not a single individual, but it's still very much limited to sort of a handful of the wealthiest elite members of the community. And so we start to see a lot of sort of intra-elite competition. So really, to the extent that we see any sort of discord or unrest, it's amongst those elite sort of jockeying for power or trying to position themselves more favorably. And then a lot of this generates this sort of outward consumption and sort of demonstrations of wealth. So how one dresses, clothing, jewelry, they're importing a lot of luxury goods from the East to sort of reflect their exalted status within society. The other thing that we see develop during this period, and it seems to be kind of a common feature across Greek society, but is very much associated later with Athens, is the symposia. And that's what you see sort of depicted in this artwork here. So again, we see a lot of sort of Eastern features in this. So this essentially was like a drinking party where members of sort of this closed aristocracy, these small groups would come together, maybe a dozen people. And there would be a collective meal. They would eat while reclining. And so you can kind of see that there. There would be sort of a central container where they would mix the wine. And they would usually go through a couple of gallons of wine per meal. They would mix it with water so it wouldn't be super strong. And then there would be this meal, there would be discussion. In some of the symposium examples that you see, like Socrates, it's very intellectual discussion. Most of them were probably not quite at that level. There would also be sort of entertainment. So women were specifically excluded from these gatherings. They were held in what's called the andron, or the men's room of the sort of the household structure. And so there was this entertaining center and then a ring of couches around. So women were excluded, except you can see here this sort of woman playing the flute in what's sort of a transparent dress. So they would have sort of dancing girls or prostitutes come. Maybe they would have sort of like circus performers. So there would be this element of entertainment. They're probably based on some of the readings as well as some of the images that we see, perhaps engagement in some sexual activities at times, but it was sort of this reinforcement of the elite sort of status of these individuals and their sort of position within society. So another feature that's really important is the hoplite phalanx. And again, the Greeks decide to really be innovative in thinking about how they fight. The hoplite itself isn't super like a super innovative departure from the way other people fight. The hoplite is the infantryman. So you can see he's sort of depicted here. So the hoplite is the soldier. He's named for the hoplon. So this is the shield that he has. It's about 5 feet in diameter. And then he fights with a spear, and then he would have had a short sword for closer sort of hand-to-hand combat. Gradually also developing armor. So pretty typically just sort of a helmet and then a breastplate, but some of them would have also had sort of coverings for their shins. This form of warfare becomes distinctive when you sort of put them into combination. And that's where the phalanx formation comes in. So then about 8 men across and maybe 10 men deep is sort of the phalanx. And that's the real innovation. So most armies at the time would have just kind of lined up randomly, or even as you saw in the Iliad, sort of, the chariot combat that was really the driver there, which was more common in Eastern warfare. You don't have this sense of sort of an organized men standing next to men and then a very sort of deliberate progression forward. So the front line would engage with the enemy, and then after a certain amount of time, they would fall into the back. And then the next row would step up, and then they would fight, and then they would fall into the back. So it's very regimented and organized, and it was enormously successful because of that, in part because these other armies just weren't fighting that way, and they didn't have sort of the technique. The other theory too is if you are standing sort of shoulder to shoulder in this line, then you have this sort of these overlapping shields. So kind of what we associate with a Roman legion, where they used the shield sort of collectively as a defensive mechanism as well. The extent to which that worked, we're still kind of figuring out, but it would have given them a lot more protection than just kind of a single hand-to-hand combat. So, what's the significance of the hoplite phalanx? Militarily, it was extraordinarily effective. There's no doubt about that. And Sparta really perfects it. And so, we'll see that sort of moving forward as a key to Spartan success. It does take skill, it takes a lot of practice. In part because you're operating in formation, there needs to be an accepted set of commands, an accepted set of like what you do when, expectations. And so one of the theories that historians have posed in the past is that as in order to develop the phalanx, you need to bring in men who aren't just warrior elite. So it has this sort of equalizing effect because you're drawing men from sort of lower down the ranks. Then, in combination with that, there's no distinction of when you line up by socioeconomic status. So your kind of modest farmer could be fighting along a very wealthy aristocrat. So there was for a time this sort of scholarly belief that the hoplite phalanx was directly connected to the emergence of democracy, because as these men become more and more responsible for defense of their community, instead of just entrusting it to this warrior elite, they demanded a voice in government. And so that kind of, in conjunction with a few other developments, sort of explains this sort of dispersion of political voices across parts of the community. Increasingly, that's really been sort of criticized. We really don't know the extent to which this one played into another. Was it causal, or was it just sort of a correlation? Also, you don't really see these full phalanx formations until the end of the Archaic period. But I mean, there is certainly something sort of to that theory. It's logical, but how much it actually sort of was the impetus, the driving force behind the evolution of democracy is unclear. This is a Corinthian helmet. This was a very typical sort of choice. So about 40% of men in the Greek world by the 6th century could afford all the arms and the weapons necessary to fight. And so that's a pretty significant percentage of your male population. And then so even though this sort of limited visibility, it did give a lot of protection, especially to the head. So the other sort of feature that marks this period is increasingly over time, the emergence of colonies. And these colonies are not at all like the colonies that we're familiar with, sort of New England colonies or even imperial colonies. They operated differently. So what you start to see, especially as you move towards the end of this Archaic period, population increases in a lot of these places, and so very limited resources. So population increases, but agricultural land doesn't increase. And remember the topography of Greece, there isn't a lot of that to go around in the first place. So property, in order to be a citizen, you have to own property. And so as more and more people become non-property owners, then they lose that political voice. And this leads to some unrest and some instability. And again, because of the sources, we just have sort of a few glimpses of some of these developments. But we do know that there seems to be amongst the elite, but more so amongst that sort of next rung of people, some dissatisfaction with how things are changing over time. So then the natural sort of safety valve for some of this frustration was you would take sort of a contingent of people within your community. So for example, let's use the city of Corinth. So there's a small sort of maybe a dozen families within Corinth who decide they want to set out and establish a colony. So they go to this sort of northern area of Corcyra, which is on the Mediterranean, right across from Italy. So they are politically independent from Corinth. So Corcyra is a colony of Corinth. They have their own government. They establish their own polis. They do maintain sort of some trade agreements just to sort of facilitate economic exchange. And then there is sort of a given that militarily they will continue to sort of be allies, but otherwise these Greek colonies are very much independent of the place where they left. And so you can see the highest concentration of these Greek colonies is sort of along parts of Italy there and Sicily. So there is a lot of sort of looking to the west for this ability to expand. They also do settle up along the Black Sea a little bit, though that's a little bit more challenging because a lot of that is controlled by the Persians. So these colonies function initially very effectively as this sort of safety valve. So you have this competition for resources, and expansion becomes a very effective solution for that. They also stimulate trade because you have people sort of across these areas then that now have this common language, maybe even, relationships. Some of them might be personally related, and so this sort of makes sense for them. The other thing that happens is as they trade sort of further away and across these larger bodies of water, they begin to implement sort of warships. So the first triremes are ships that are used to carry goods, but they also have a defensive element. And then there is some sort of discussion of the extent to which they spread this sort of pan-Hellenic spirit, making sort of this, exporting some of this Greek culture in a way that then is sort of reflected in certain gatherings like the one that's pictured here. So this is an early mosaic of the Olympic Games. So you can see the olive branches, the one man is holding a discus. So there is some suggestion among scholars that these things go hand in hand. So the Olympic Games are just probably the most well-known of a number of international festivals. They were 4 really prominent ones that were becoming more and more popular in this ancient world. And initially they emerged as kind of a way for members of this elite aristocracy to kind of gather together and sort of foster this sort of common culture. They deliberately chose neutral locations so that places that weren't necessarily controlled by any one city-state, so that they could sort of guarantee the safety of anyone who came. By the 7th century, we see they're starting to build things like stadiums, gymnasiums. A gymnasium is a Greek word for like a place where one exercises naked. So they would bring together people from sort of across these different pulleys. You had to be a Greek citizen to participate. And initially, this was sort of about demonstrating one's athletic prowess, demonstrating one's skill with horses. But more and more, it starts to take on also this other significance of sort of distinguishing the city-state from which you come. So initially, they have sort of prizes. Gradually, if you win an Olympic game or an Olympic event, you just get this sort of crown of olive branches. So it's a symbolic victory. Then when you go back to your city-state, that's where the actual remuneration comes. So some of these guys will be promised like food for life. A lot of them have statues that are erected to them. Sometimes this translates into political office. So this sort of distinguishing oneself at these international festivals like the Olympic Games really does become a way to gain not just fame, but money and sometimes sort of authority. But at the end of the day, while it does bring together these people from across the Greek world, they're not really celebrating this shared sense of Greekness. It's more about distinguishing one's sort of local identity, the polis that one is from. They're really the ones that are in competition with each other. So even though we talk about the evolution of democracy, there is sort of another stage along the way as we move from monarchy to oligarchy to democracy, and that takes the form of tyranny. Tyranny now has a very negative connotation. Some of this comes from the experience of Athens in the 6th century, but a lot of it comes from more just sort of the modern usage. The definition of a tyrant is just an individual who comes to power in an unorthodox manner. So he's not necessarily elected. He's not necessarily inheriting his office. And so most of these tyrants that we see across ancient Greece, and they end up almost everywhere across ancient Greece. The one exception is Sparta. They're just really sort of this rivalry amongst these aristocrats leads one to be able to successfully position himself to seize control. And he has to sort of work, make some connections with other families who support him. He also needs the help of sort of his own family. So there's a lot of intermarriage, sort of trying to build up a base of power. It's not despotic. It's not unconstitutional, because most of these places don't have constitutions when the tyrant sort of comes to power. So it's almost like a different way of trying out how to provide stability and order as they move away from monarchy. A lot of these tyrants actually presented themselves as champions, not of the elite, but of the middle and lower classes. And so many of them engage in like public works, which would put people who don't have jobs to work and give them sort of a stable, regular income. A lot of them spent a lot of resources on sort of monumental building, sort of building temples, building agoras, sort of common markets. And so many of them were really very popular amongst the common people. This one in particular is Periander of Corinth. What we do see from most of them, though, was it was sort of a one and done. Like their success was very much tied to their individual person, their charisma, their ability to build up alliances. When they died, power seldom passed to their heirs. When they tried to make that happen, things kind of went off the rails. So 650 to 510, we see this form of government across the Greek world, but eventually the very last tyrant is going to be ejected from Athens in 510, and they seem to kind of collectively decide that that's not really a viable form of governing, and it ultimately is just antithetical to Greek democratic ideals. And then finally, what we do see developing during this period, which is so important moving forward, is literacy. So the Greeks had that script, that linear B. They borrowed that from the Phoenicians. It doesn't have vowels, and so it's really very limited in what one can do in terms of matching the spoken language to the written language. They're still speaking ancient Greek, but what they do is they invent a new alphabet that has vowels. And you can see that depicted in this kylix, this drinking bowl here. So it's much more versatile. It gives them a lot more ability to sort of match letters to their spoken language. And then the other thing that really happens that we do not see elsewhere is they expand usage beyond just basic sort of economic accounting or financial sort of usages. So before, writing was very much just sort of keeping inventory or keeping track of commerce, but now we see it expand into wider public uses, so sort of commemoration, actually sort of writing down summaries of events, but also private uses. And so this is when sort of the literary arm of Greek culture is really going to advance, and we're going to see sort of the foundation of a lot of that literary culture moving forward.